Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Law News Network. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. Today, we are continuing in Day 5 of the Adam Matos case out of Pasco County, Florida. Adam Matos, you see him right there. He's been accused of brutally murdering his ex-girlfriend, Megan Brown, her two parents, Margaret Brown and Gregory Brown, as well as her new boyfriend, Nicholas Leonard, in a savage quadruple homicide. Megan, it should be noted, was the mother of Matos' son, Tristan. He goes by the name Tristan. He was 4 years old at the time. Now he's 8 years old. Prosecutors have said that the evidence in this case will show that Mr. Matos killed these four individuals, tried to clean it up, used their cars, their debit cards, their credit cards, and sold their belongings and tried to escape. The prosecutor in this case has said that if this was a book, the title of the book would be, "I Almost Got Away with It." It should be noted that Mr. Matos does face the possibility of the death penalty if he is convicted. Now, yesterday we saw some really crucial and riveting testimony from family members and friends. I just want to briefly summarize what they said, and then we'll talk a little bit about the specifics of this case. Again, we're going to have our live coverage in the Adam Matos case at around 9:30, 9:45. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to turn to it. But let me tell you a little bit about what you might have missed yesterday. So we saw the testimony of Jim Thomas. First, he was the father of Margaret Brown, the grandfather of Megan, the father-in-law to Gregory. He helped move the Browns into their house in Florida. Remember, they were coming from Pennsylvania. He testified about his knowledge of Adam Matos being the biological father of Tristan, whether he knew that Matos and Megan were sleeping in the same bedroom in that house in Pasco County, Florida. He also testified to the fact that Gregory Brown had kept unloaded firearms in the master bedroom. Finally, he also talked about how he would call his daughter Maggie, as he was so affectionately called her. He would call her 4 to 6 times a day between August 28th and August 30th. Remember, those are the crucial dates. We believe that these murders happened on August 28th. He said he spoke to her regularly, and when he couldn't get through to her, he kept calling her 4 to 6 times a day and couldn't get through to her. Well, after that happened, he had his wife call the police and do a welfare check, and we know how everything turned out after that. We also saw the testimony of Daniel Leonard. He was the father of Nicholas Leonard. He too spoke to his son all the time. In fact, he spoke to him every day on the phone because they were planning on living together. He said the last time he spoke to him was August 28th. And when you hear these family members talking about the last time that they spoke to the victims, it's really heart-wrenching because they had no idea that this is the last time they'd speak to their loved ones. Interestingly, under cross-examination, I should note that the defense tried to bring up a name. They asked him whether he knew a Michelle Stinson. Now, anybody who's been researching this case will know that this is an important name that we thought that the defense was going to bring up because it is believed, and the reports out there, that Michelle Stinson was stalking Nicholas Leonard. So obviously the defense wanted to bring that up. We knew from events leading into this trial that we thought that was going to be a strategy put forward by the defense, that maybe it was Michelle Stinson who's somehow involved in this crime and not Adam Matos. They couldn't bring that up under cross-examination with Daniel Leonard because the prosecution objected. They said it was outside the scope of his testimony, and I think that was a right call by the judge to sustain that. We'll talk about that in a minute. You saw also the testimony of Tanya Carlson. She's a friend of Nicholas Leonard, knew him for years, and also the co-worker of Megan at the Fisherman's Shack. She was the one who introduced Nicholas and Megan, and they started having a relationship from there. She also testified that she observed Adam Matos come into the Fisherman's Shack. There was a tense interaction between him and Megan ended up leaving with him before she had the chance to speak with her new boss, Jim Siegler. Remember, she had just started working at the Fisherman's Shack. I believe Tanya only knew Megan for about a month and a half. She said she was a great employee and even a friend. Speaking of them being friends, in fact, on the night of August 27th, remember it was August 28th when we believe these murders happened. On the night of August 22nd, Tanya went out to drinks with Megan and Nick Leonard, and during that time, she observed that Adam Matos continually sent text messages to Megan, and these were not good text messages. They were questioning her as a parent. He was using profanity. He told her to come home. Remember that morning, so we're talking now the early morning of August 28th. If you remember, Megan made a 911 call to about how Adam Matos threatened her with a knife. And Tanya Carlson testified to the fact that Megan called her, told her what happened, knew that she wasn't going to be coming into work, but Megan would never come into work again. And not only that, Megan's car, the night that they all went out for drinks, August 27th, Megan left her car at the Fisherman's Shack. And in the days after this, no one came to pick the car up. So what Tanya Carlson did, and she testified to this, she blocked Megan's car and blocked that car and made sure that no one would take it, and anybody who wanted to take it would have to come in and see her. We'll talk about that car in a minute. I also just want to briefly tell you about the testimony of Michael Unsworth, a very good friend of Nicholas. He testified to the fact that he knew what was going on between Megan and Nick, and that also he knew that Matos had threatened Megan. And Nicholas Leonard told Michael Unsworth that he was going to go over to Megan's house, protect her, and he took his Kel-Tec pistol with him. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then finally, before we get into the real analysis of this case, I have to bring up the testimony of a neighbor, Justin Okins. Now, here's a guy who actually heard the gunshots. Now, here's the interesting part. He's testifying that he heard them much later in the night, at around 11:45 p.m. to midnight. Now, this is different from what our prior understanding was, because we thought that Margaret Brown was the last person to be killed in this quadruple homicide. If you remember, she ended her shift at Wawa's at 11:10, came home at around 11:25, we believe, and we thought she was the last person to be killed. If you remember, she suffered blunt force trauma to the head with something that was consistent with a hammer, and also she was asphyxiated with a plastic bag. Now it seems to be that it's possible that she might have been killed first, and if these gunshots came after, then we know that Megan Brown and Gregory Brown suffered gunshot wounds. That's how they died. So it's interesting now, this timeline of who got killed when. There's so much to discuss in this case, and I'm glad I'm not only here to talk about it just myself, but I have someone to talk with it about it. And joining me now is LawNewz trial analyst Julie Rendelman. Julie, it's great to see you.
Good to see you too.
I haven't seen you in a while.
I know, I've missed you.
I missed you too. So now we have a lot to talk about.
Sure.
Okay, I want to first talk about this new timeline that we just were shocked about. That we always thought that Margaret Brown was killed last. Now it seems that she might have been killed first. And I think it's interesting the way that you have these 4 victims that were killed in different ways. Some blunt force trauma, some gunshot wounds. What do you make of that?
I don't know that I make anything of it. And keep in mind that, like, when we hear from a witness who gives an approximate as to the time, he may not be accurate. So, and him being off by 20 minutes or 25 minutes makes all the difference in terms of potentially who was killed first. Also, we don't know if shots were fired at that point and shots were fired earlier, that no one either was walking by at the time or no one heard it. In terms of, for me, for this case, we talk, I know the prosecutor's doing a great job of kind of laying out the timeline, so that the jurors can at least understand how each individual victim ended up at the house. In terms of whether or not Matos is the person that committed this crime, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who was killed first. It doesn't matter how they were killed first. I don't think it changes in any way, shape, or form the fact that there's no question that Matos is the person that committed the crime.
But does it add the question to if they were killed in a different way? It's not like they were all shot, but also blunt force trauma. It's interesting to note, how did this all happen in the sense where did Nicholas Leonard, was he struck first, and then perhaps Megan Brown and Gregory Brown saw what happened? They got shot, and then finally Maggie got shot. So right. What I think it's interesting, it adds for me listening to this, was there possibly 2 perpetrators of this crime? Was there 1 perpetrator? How does the time frame work? Because we saw questions on our message board that how is it possible this guy could have killed all 4 individuals by himself, unless, as Aaron Keller has said, there was some sort of explosive argument. Perhaps it was a powder keg. We know that now Nicholas Leonard brought a gun to this situation. Sure. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, first of all, Nicholas said he brought a gun. I don't know that we don't know for sure that he actually did. But we have to assume, my assumption always, and perhaps I'm wrong, was that each individual in a sense was killed one by one, like that each person kind of entered into the House of Horrors and was killed individually. The fact that Nicholas and Megan had more of the blunt force trauma, to me more indicates kind of an act of anger and rage. Especially, I think Nicholas was beaten 21 times.
And we're not even sure if it was after he died.
Exactly, or at least when he was unconscious.
Yeah.
And so, I don't I don't believe there was more than one perpetrator in this case. I don't think that anything about the fact, based on the shots, based on the blunt force trauma, that in itself indicates that he couldn't have been the one that did each thing. Now, as to why it is that he used a gun versus something else, I have no idea. I don't know if it was because if Megan and Nick had been killed first and he just decided, you know what, it's an easier way to kill them off if I have the gun, to shoot any individuals that come in that can be potential witnesses. I don't know kind of what his thinking is, but to me that in no way indicates that there was more than one person.
What I think is interesting, we know that he called Megan, I think like 120 times from the night of August 27th until the afternoon of August 28th, and then he never called her again.
Right.
So what I thought was, I thought that these murders, if he did this, happened in the early afternoon, and there was that time frame until Margaret Brown came home. Now it's like, what happened in that time period?
I still think that.
Yeah.
You know, so the testimony of this witness hasn't changed that for me.
Okay.
And it makes more sense. The timeline that we originally talked about makes more sense. Again, in terms of, you know, his accuracy in regards to the exact timing of when he heard the shots, or whether those shots, who those shots were aimed at that time, I don't know, but I still believe that the course of events that we believed in terms of her being killed first are as we thought they would be.
Julie, let's make sense of something, because I'm a bit confused about one thing. Tanya Carlson testified again. She's the friend of Nicholas Leonard, knew him for years. I think she knew him since 2007. He kept coming into the Fisherman's Shack where she worked. Then she was also the co-worker of Megan Brown. There was a part where she testified to the fact that Adam Matos, and I correct me if I'm wrong, I think this might have been one of the first few days that Megan had started her new job. She wanted to have a meeting with her boss, Jim Siegler. Adam Matos comes into the Fisherman's Shack, and there's a tense interaction, and she ends up leaving with Adam Matos before she has a chance to speak with her boss. That's what the jury heard. What we heard, because there was a meeting between the judge and the attorneys, was that this actually got physical. That apparently Adam Matos came in and almost dragged her out of that restaurant. Interestingly, the prosecution said they're not going to talk about that. They're not going to bring up the fact that he dragged her out, or they used a physical force to get her out. Why do you think the prosecution wouldn't want that? I'm very curious.
I don't know that you're going to hear a good answer, because I have not a clue.
Interesting, right?
If the answer was that the judge found it too prejudicial,
Maybe.
I would disagree with him.
Yeah.
But then it would make more sense. But for the prosecution,
Disagree with her. Yeah.
But for the prosecution to decide on their own that it's almost too much evidence makes absolutely no sense to me. It shows a motive. It shows the anger. It shows everything that you want that forms a basis for why each of these individuals are dead. So no, I have no idea whatsoever.
The judge ruled that she could testify to the fact that he came in, there was a tense interaction, and Megan left with him. She didn't want any comments about that he made her leave or anything like that. I understood from the judge, but the fact that the prosecution didn't even try to go to that way to try and show there was a little bit more physical force used, or that he exercised some sort of control over her, it was more than just to show, this is all the jury heard. There was a tense interaction, and she ended up leaving with him.
For the life, I have no idea why that wouldn't come in. I don't know why a judge wouldn't allow it in, and I don't know why a prosecutor wouldn't pursue that. It'd be one thing if this happened 3 months before, you know, and the argument would be, how is this relevant? But if it's happening so close in time to the time of which this incident happened, I don't know how the jury shouldn't know about it.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
But we're a legal website. We're a legal network. Let's just break it down a little bit about this other aspect. Tanya Carlson testified to the fact that when she was out with Megan Brown and Nicholas Leonard, there were all these text messages that were sent from Adam Matos to Megan Brown, and they were, you know, really using profanity, saying she should come home. Interestingly, she couldn't testify to just text messages, only the ones that she saw. They asked her, how did you do this, and how did you know that he texted? Because I actually saw the phone.
Right.
That's important, right?
Right. She could only testify to that of which she actually saw on her own. I mean, I guess the argument is that there's hearsay.
Not what Megan said, oh, Adam's texting me.
Right. Although one would argue that the actual text messages themselves, if they exist, can all come in as, again, an indication of a motive on the part of Matos to kill, or an indication of his intent to kill her. So while she herself may not be able to testify to everything that was text, only those of which she saw, she certainly, in terms of the text messages themselves, should be able to come in.
What's interesting to me about this is that The prosecution hasn't been so clear about a motive. What we see kind of happening with the evidence and the testimony is we know that they were in a volatile relationship. We know that the night before he was texting her and really wanted her to come home. We know that there was that he threatened her with a knife in the morning, and then everything happened afterwards. But when we just followed the Luis Toledo case,
right?
Okay, we knew that Yesenia Suarez had cheated on him, that the prosecution said that it drove him into a craze, and he killed the children after he killed Yesenia because they were witnesses. The fact that the prosecution hasn't articulated a motive, and that's not an element of a crime, I can understand maybe why this happened, but are they losing some jurors on this?
Not at all. I mean, just so we're clear, you know, I think they are making out a motive. It might not be like as clear as Toledo, where you have a guy who goes to his wife's place of work and confronts the individual that he believes is cheating. In terms of this specific case, we don't know what transpired in the house when this all went down. So we don't know if Matos caught them together. We don't know kind of the exact scenarios that occurred, you know, that pushed him to that degree. But certainly, based on everything we know, that there seemed to be a feeling on his part that he was losing his wife or losing his girlfriend. That, to me, in and of itself, is the motive you need. And quite honestly, I don't think you need anything in regards to this case because the evidence is so overwhelming as to who the person is that's responsible.
So what is the defense doing here? Because they haven't presented an opening argument. I keep asking everybody that I have on this. They haven't presented an opening argument as of yet. They've reserved their right for maybe if they decide to conclude the case, for the prosecution after they conclude their case, they might put on their case. But also, we see kind of they're bringing up this Michelle Stinson, and I still don't understand what their strategy is. What do you make of it?
I don't know that they necessarily know what their strategy is, and this is not necessarily a comment on their abilities. I think, you know, on a case like this, you're in a bad spot, as is. You have an uphill battle. I think that they have to be very careful the road they take. If they go down the Michelle Stinson road and the jury finds him guilty, then they have to do a complete reversal and say, please save his life, and kind of go down the reasons that A, he did it, and B, there's mitigation. And so I think as a defense attorney, knowing full well the likelihood of a conviction and the likelihood that a jury is going to be considering death, I think you have to be really careful with that Michelle Stinson issue because no one's going to buy that this woman killed all 4 individuals, as far as I'm concerned. And so I think that they're kind of stuck. I'm surprised, to be honest, that they didn't pursue prior to the start of this case some type of mental disease or defect or something that indicated that this person had snapped either a doctor's testimony, anyone that kind of would have mitigated the actions of this person. And so that, I admit, surprises me because that to me would have been kind of the only way to avoid the strong potential that he's going to be getting death.
Because he stayed at the house. He was there. Everything since August 28th, selling the belongings, using the debit cards, driving the car, buying the shovel, ordering pizza, hanging out, being at that house.
It's overwhelming evidence of his guilt, but it's also overwhelming evidence that there's something not right going on with this guy. There is something incredibly peculiar to killing an entire family and then selling off dogs and not thinking much about the idea that people are going to eventually figure out that you're the person that has killed these individuals. So there is something incredibly peculiar about his behavior. So I'm surprised they didn't go down that road. Now, maybe they didn't because the defendant refuses to go down that road. I don't know. But in terms of strategy, they may not have a strategy. They may be waiting kind of to see what comes out and then make a decision at that point which way they're going.
What's interesting is I thought that they would just keep attacking witness after witness and try to really hit on their credibility or hit on the methods that were used by investigators. I'm not hearing that. I'm not seeing that. If I'm in the jury right now, I still am siding with the prosecution's case. I don't see them making strong arguments as of yet.
But the problem they have is you have to be careful again because on a case where you're dealing with a potential death penalty, where the evidence is overwhelming, you don't want to get the jury angry with you. So if you start attacking witnesses, that there's really no reason for certain individuals to lie about the time they heard things. You know, they don't have any kind of anything in the game, and so you have to be careful to not attack every single person and turn off the jury because you're going to need them. As far as I'm concerned, you're going to need them at the sentencing phase to respect you and kind of want to kind of listen to what you have to say at that point.
I'm curious if he is convicted and at the sentencing phase, they'll try and use something along the lines of, which we kind of saw in the Luis Toledo case. There was expert testimony that he suffered from traumatic injuries to his brain and that he had problems with impulse control.
Right.
I'm curious if they will try to explain the activities of a man who committed these crimes and stayed in the house and did all these things and acted as if nothing was wrong, to try and show to the jury, you can't sentence this guy to death, he's not all there.
I think I absolutely can't imagine that they won't go down that road, and the question becomes, is it a strategy not to do it now?
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know. You know, maybe look, they're just trying to get through this stage in a sense, because there's two. Look, I don't mean to be biased, but there's no question in my mind he's going to be found guilty. And so there's two stages to this case. There's the guilt phase and the sentencing phase. And they may just try to, and a lot of defense attorneys do this. They just want to get through this stage, you know, cross that of which they should, which is, you know, the doctor to kind of pull out some issues in regards to his inability to figure out the time of death, so it doesn't go quite exactly how the prosecution says, and then hope at the sentencing phase that they have kind of what they need to keep him alive. To
explain how he might have been thinking at this moment, interestingly, we had David DiPietro on yesterday. He is 100% positive that the defense will put Adam Matos on the stand. What do you think?
We've been going back and forth about this. I mean, I can't, the only reason you put Matos on the stand, as far as I'm concerned, is to explain why he killed them, not to explain that he didn't kill them. Because again, what people fail to remember is, if he gets on the stand and says he did not kill these individuals and he's found guilty, what happens at the sentencing phase? Because now you have an individual that is completely unremorseful for the deaths of these individuals. Again, is it possible that Mr. Matos, you know, decides he wants to do what he wants to do and he's getting on the stand regardless of what his attorneys want? That's possible, but I'm telling you, you know, he is in big trouble if that's the decision he's making.
Well, it's interesting because we saw that Jeffrey Willis, he took the stand. Didn't work out so well for him. He got convicted. Luis Toledo put on a whole case. He didn't take the stand, but as soon as he was convicted, he said, sentence me to death. So it's hard to know, I guess, what their game plan is and what the client really wants. It's tough. Any which way, we can't forget that if he is put on the stand and he does deny it, all of his prior bad acts, you know, this guy has had trouble with the law before, that will be thrown in.
Well, you know, there's usually a hearing prior to him testifying to make a determination as to what specific acts are allowed to be allowed for the prosecutor to question him about. And they're not allowed to ask him about anything. They're only allowed to ask him about those things that the court deems go to his credibility. And the judge has to kind of weigh background in terms of what convictions he has, what bad acts he has, to make a determination as to what comes in and what doesn't. Because you can't have it be that the jury just finds someone guilty because of his prior acts. But it opens the door to a lot.
Well, we saw when Tanya Carlson testified under cross-examination, I think it was the last question she was asked by the defense was, have you ever been convicted of a crime? And she says, yes, how many? 4. And that was, okay, we have no more questions. Right. So that is like a little hint to try and show that she might not be reliable?
Right, yeah, I mean, look, a defense attorney is going to ask questions. You know,
I just feel like they're scrapping for anything right now.
They may be. I mean, we were talking about this yesterday because I hated saying that it's possible they just don't have a direction, but they really may not have a direction.
And it feels like
it does, and that's, you know what, they have a right in a certain way not to have that direction, and that's kind of, you know, people are not happy with the fact that they didn't open. Yeah. I'm not as a prosecutor, I love when someone doesn't open because to me it's like they're giving up. The difference here is they haven't waived, they have reserved, and so they very well may get up there, and in a way it's a good strategy because they're waiting to hear everything the prosecution gives and then and then basically bringing out an opening to say what they failed to do. I'm hopeful that maybe that's where they're headed, but again, I think that in my mind their strategy is, you know, the end road, which is the sentencing phase.
Well, I think it would be kind of entertaining from multiple areas to see them put on a case and maybe try to blame it on someone else and put Adam Matos on the stand. I mean, that would be a really interesting maneuver. We have to see what they do. I do have a question about one of the victims in this case, Gregory Brown. You keep hearing people testifying to he had back surgery. He wasn't able to carry heavy boxes. In fact, Jim Thomas talked about it himself, that He had to help move the boxes himself. Gregory couldn't do anything. I wonder, is this keep being brought up by the prosecution to kind of go against Aaron Keller's theory, where if this was a powder keg, that there was violence, and that maybe Gregory Brown was the assailant and Adam Matos was the one who was in defense? Is that what they're trying to show, that this was a guy who couldn't even lift up a box, so he's a helpless victim?
I think they're covering all their bases. I mean, for the very reason they're doing such a specific timeline for each of the individuals to show kind of when they were last seen. I think they're covering all their bases. By the way, even if a jury were to accept that someone started the fight, there's still not going to be an explanation as to why 4 people are now dead, although it may kind of, again, mitigate his actions. I'm sure that that's kind of, where they're headed, especially if that's remember, as a prosecutor, they don't know where the defense is going. They have no idea if he's testifying. They have no idea what he's going to say. So they have to make sure they cover every single possible defense that the defendant will come out with. So it makes sense to do that.
One interesting little tidbit from yesterday was when Tanya Carlson was testifying, she said she blocked Megan Brown's car so that anybody that wanted to take the car would have to come into the Fisherman's Shack first. And she did that because she kind of got a weird feeling after everything that she knew about the 911 call. She knew about the Adam Matos text messages. Megan Brown wasn't showing up to work. She wasn't returning calls. And I thought that was interesting that she did that and wanted she didn't want anybody to take it. What ended up happening was that after the Fisherman's Shack closed at 2 a.m., the next morning the car was gone.
Right.
So that's going to come into the prosecution's, I think, closing argument somehow. Wouldn't you agree?
Look, she knew something was wrong, and that's why she did what she did. And the reason she blocked it was because she was hoping that the person who would come in would be the person that was potentially responsible for why she was missing. So I don't think it's going to be a big factor in the case, but it certainly shows that she was just like everyone knew that something had happened to this poor girl.
What about that Tampa Bay Times article, that Tampa Bay Times interview, that Adam Matos that he gave while he was in jail? There's right there in that red shirt. I think it was when he gave it. He gave that interview. I don't know if he was represented at the time. I don't think if he was, he should have done it, but that's coming back. That will come back to haunt him. I know we heard a little bit about it at the beginning of the case, that segment portions of it will come in. I mean, come on.
Look, this happens all the time. As a defense attorney, you have clients that kind of beat to their own drum, which is exactly why we have the possibility that he's going to take the stand and say what he wants. Will it come back to haunt him? It will. It certainly will come back to haunt him if he testifies in any way differently to what he said in the interview. Again, and I don't mean to like beat a dead horse, but the evidence is so overwhelming against this guy, as far as I'm concerned, that they don't need any interview for the jury to do what they're going to do.
What's for you, if you're sitting on that jury and you just heard the prosecution's opening statement? They're still presenting now all the evidence to support it, but we know, we see the research.
Right.
What is it for you, the top maybe 3 pieces of evidence that you're like, oh my gosh?
If I was the prosecutor, I would say to them, you don't even need to think about what happened in the house when those deaths occurred. The only thing you need to think about, forgetting everything for 1 second, is the fact that he just went in and sold the dogs and sold the TV and wouldn't let people in the house. That in and of itself.
That's okay.
You can just hold it. And I can hold it like Phil Donahue. That in and of itself is overwhelming evidence that he is involved in the deaths of these individuals, and that something's not right with this guy.
I agree with you, Julie. Well, we're going to have to stick around. Stay tuned, because we will be going to a live feed soon, but I do want to play a previous clip for our viewers. This is great analysis so far, Julie, so let's stick around and we'll talk more about it.